guess what? It's Wednesday night. Whenever you're watching this, you're like, it's not whenever you're watching this. I'm just totally stoked to get a little time with you, hang out, connect, and have some God connection and what's happening in your life. And I've been thinking about this lately, the question about like getting out of the boat. And you're like, what does that mean? Well, I've been thinking about Peter with Jesus. And, I know Peter, he was a fisherman, and his boat was his profession. So it was a place of comfort, familiarity, the things that he knew that were kind of established, and it was his day in and day out reality. I mean, this was just the normal, customary thing that he did. He relied on his boat as the transportation, his office, if you will, so that he could earn a living. And it's interesting because I think sometimes in our lives, there are areas and places, seasons that we go through that are comfortable to us. They're familiar. We know it's kind of established. And I think if we're not careful sometimes, if we don't get out of our comfort zone, I know that's kind of cliche, but I still think it's worth considering, because I think sometimes God is asking us to have more, to be more, to see more. But we have to kind of think about our comfort zone. And so I think about this is really relevant with Peter, because the first time you meet Peter, he's not in his boat. This is when the very first time that we see some interaction. Wow, that was amazing. My microphone just got caught in my knees there. That was fun. I know if you're watching, you're like, that was interesting. It was less than boring. But I'm going to bring us back to our comfort zone and Peter being out of the boat. So in Luke chapter 5, it says that Jesus came to the Sea of Galilee, and the big crowd was there with him. And I get the impression that it's in the morning time. It says that Peter was on the shore, mending and cleaning his nets. And Jesus said, "Can I borrow your boat?" And Peter said, "Sure." So Jesus gets in Peter's boat, and begins to speak to the big crowd in front of him. And I think that's really interesting that Jesus gets in Peter's boat. I think it's worth considering, because do we invite Jesus to participate in our comfort zone? Do we invite Jesus to participate in our profession, whatever it is that we do? However we do our day-to-day life, do we let Jesus join that place that's so familiar and comfortable and relaxed, common to us? We know this place and space very well. And sometimes that can be a place and a space. Sometimes that can be our profession. Sometimes that can be just kind of our routines, that we just going through the day-to-day stuff that we do, in and out, whatever, But do we invite Jesus? Do we let Jesus use the things that are comfortable for us for Jesus' purposes and design? I don't think Peter really knew what he was getting into when he let Jesus borrow his boat. But in the meantime, Jesus says this giant, message or whatever. We don't know what Jesus said actually to the crowd. We just know that Peter and his fishing partners were on the shore, mending their nets. And when Jesus is done talking, he comes back and says, "Hey, did you catch anything?" And Peter's like, "No." And Jesus said, "Put your boat out, throw the net over, and you'll get a giant catch of fish." And Peter's like, "We fished all night. We didn't catch anything. We're the professionals here. We know how to fish. Who are you to tell us how to fish? You just did some theology thing, right? Since when did you become, some Johnny on the spot expert for fishing?" Peter's like, "Nevertheless, at your word." And I just think sometimes we really need to invite Jesus to come into our comfort zone. And that's the beginning. That's the beginning of a really interesting relationship for Peter with Jesus. And from that point on, Peter goes out, they put their nets over, and they catch a giant thing of fish. They haul it back to the shore, and Peter falls at Jesus' feet and says, "Away from me, I'm a sinful man," which is weird to me. I'm like, you got the biggest catch of your life, and you're telling the guy who helped you do that to get away? That's like, I'd be like, whew, can you hang out more? But thankfully, Jesus says, "Follow me, and I will make you a fisher of men." You've been fishing for smelly fish for years, Peter, but I have a bigger design, a bigger identity, purpose in you. And I think sometimes we have to get out of our boat, leave our boat, to follow Jesus. And maybe Jesus is asking you to leave some of the things that are familiar and comfortable for you, to have a closer walk with Jesus. And I think that can happen in a lot of ways. It can happen with how we use our time. It can happen with our finances. It can happen in our profession, and pushing the envelope in some of these areas where we become comfortable. And comfortable can be a synonym, can be like steps towards complacent. And I want to, with diplomacy and grace, I want to ruffle your feathers a little bit and maybe ask you to consider, have I become complacent and comfortable? It's interesting for this season because I think we've come through COVID and, we're finding like a new norm and kind of getting back in our groove, right? And I think that's great. But if our groove is more comfortable than following Jesus, then maybe we need to, upset the apple cart a little bit and get out of the boat, leave the comfort zone. But the second place you see Peter get out of the boat, this is in Matthew 14. And this is Jesus, Peter's in the boat at nighttime with his buddies, and there's this giant storm that's happening. And Jesus had stayed on the shore. He was dismissing the crowd, and he stayed there. But they're in the boat at night in this massive storm, and they see Jesus walking on the water. And literally in the Greek, it's the word phantasm. And they're like, that freaks them out. It should freak them out, right? Do you ever see anybody at nighttime in a storm walking on the water? That's not your normal, regular experience. And remember, these guys are familiar with nighttime in a boat on the Sea of Galilee because they're fishermen. They're familiar. This is not a foreign experience for them. But to see Jesus walking on the water, that is very, very foreign. And I appreciate what Peter says. Everybody else is super scared and like, oh, it's a ghost. They're freaked. And I get it. That would freak me out too. But I like what Peter says because he says to Jesus, he says, Lord, if it's you, bid me come. And I think that was really an interesting thing that Peter said because Peter knew that Jesus always wants to be close. Jesus always wants to be adjacent, in the vicinity, close by, always is saying, inviting us. Hey, let's get closer. Let's have a closer relationship. Let's have a closer walk. Let's be together more. Have greater fellowship, greater intimacy. Jesus is always on the 10 level of connecting with us. And maybe we get to, think, well, be less or more. But Peter knows that about Jesus. And he knows if it's a ghost, the ghost's going to be like, yeah. But if it's really Jesus, the litmus test is that Jesus will say, come. And it is Jesus. And I appreciate that Peter gets out of the boat. Again, getting out of his comfort zone, getting out of what's safe, what's familiar, what's known, what's stable, and walking to Jesus in a storm on the water. Like, that's a miracle. And I think sometimes we forego the miracles that Jesus has for us, sometimes because we don't get out of the boat. We don't get out of our comfort zone. A friend of mine told me one time about a business that they owned, and he felt like God was telling him to sell the business, and it didn't make sense. It was illogical. It was a familiar business, very well established, known, but he still kept feeling this push in his heart, sell the business. And so he's like, okay. So he sold the business. And it was challenging with the finances, right? I mean, like, how are we going to have income now? We need it, now what are we going to do? But he agreed with what he sensed God saying in his heart. He got out of the boat, sold the business, and within 2 or 3 months, he had another job situation that started to really take off and just get super, super vertical and be very, very fruitful for them. And I think it's really interesting because he had to leave his comfort zone and do something to obey, walk on the water, do what seemed impossible. And then when we do that, I know this, it can get a little rocky and a little scary and the wind blowing and the waves, and we might get scared. We might freeze in the moment. We might freak out. I get it. I totally get it. And Jesus, I love that Peter starts to sink and he cries out, Lord, help me. And even in the midst of getting out of your comfort zone and you feel like you're, in tumultuous situation, season, Jesus is there to grab your hand and pull you up to keep you from drowning and being consumed. But the key thing is to keep your eyes on Jesus. If you're walking on the water and you're like, this is a miracle, then keep your eyes on Jesus. And you've got to be careful that the storms, the waves, the situations, circumstances don't get in the way of keeping your focus on Jesus. Because when we get out of the boat and we walk to Jesus, it's a very miraculous experience. And really, nobody else has walked on the water in human history except Peter. And that's a pretty cool experience. But remember, the key for it was bid me come. And Jesus is always saying, I always want a closer walk with you. I always want you to be close with me, have more connection, more intimacy. So Peter was out of the boat when he first met Jesus in Luke 5. Peter got out of the boat to walk on the water in the middle of a storm, a supernatural experience. And then the last place we see Peter get out of the boat is in John 21, verses 1 to 14. And this is after Jesus had been crucified. Peter denied Jesus. They had the whole Last Supper thing where Jesus tells Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. No, it's never going to happen. All this hubris and arrogance and certainty Peter knew. And I'm like, Jesus is pretty trustworthy. You can take it to the bank. Whatever Jesus says is going to be a whole lot more reliable than what we feel or what we see. And so there's a whole denial thing. And then Peter he denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus goes, he's crucified in the tomb for 3 days, raises from the dead. Everybody's shocked at that. That's like, drop your teeth. Resurrection, Easter Sunday, super exciting. We love it. But I appreciate that Peter and about 5, 6 of the other disciples in John chapter 21, they go back to fishing. So they leave Jerusalem and they walk back to the Sea of Galilee and pick up where they left off before Jesus came. They went back to their profession and went back to something familiar, comfortable, and stable. And I can't blame them. I think if I had been through such a tumultuous time, Jesus crucified, the uncertainty, fear that they're going to arrest us, we might be the next one's crucified. I mean, all kinds of crazy things. Now he's risen from the dead. We don't know where he is. I mean, this is a really, really bizarre season. And so I think Peter wanted some stability, wanted some familiarity. Let's go back and do something that we know, that's comfortable, that's stable and settling for us. I don't blame him. So he's fishing. He and his buddies, they're in the boat all night fishing. And when they're in the boat in the morning time, early morning, dawn, there's a guy on the shore that's got a little fire. And John looks at Peter and says, I think it's the Lord. And I like what happens when Peter hears that. He jumps out of his boat and he swims to Jesus. And I think this is the third place where we see Peter out of his comfort zone, out of what he knows, what's familiar, what's stable, what's an income, profession, whatever. He jumps out of the boat. So that he leaves the boat to walk on the water. He's out of the boat at the shore when he's mending his nets at the very beginning. And now he's purposefully jumping out of what's comfortable, familiar, known. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I have jumped in cold water in the morning, and it is very alarming. It's like just makes you freeze, your teeth are chatting. And I think Peter had some of that going on, but I appreciate that Peter was very, very focused that nothing was going to keep him from Jesus. Not cold water, not a familiar profession, not his friends who's in the boat with him, not something that's been familiar to him for year in, year out, day by day. Nothing will keep him from getting to Jesus. And that's a love and a devotion that I think was cultivated and developed and continued to grow in Peter's heart for Jesus. And when he gets to the shore, Jesus says, cast your nets on the other side, and they do. And that's when Peter jumps in because they get this giant catch of fish. But appreciate that Peter didn't stay with a catch of fish, didn't stay with what seemed to be prosperous and stable. Peter said, none of that's more important to me than being with Jesus. And I love that priority, that Jesus is top, first. And instead of saying priorities in terms of first, second, third priorities and that kind of deal, I appreciate that. I think Peter decided at this point that Jesus was the center. We sang this just Sunday in worship, Jesus at the center of it all. And at the center, then everything revolves around Jesus. So not necessarily first, but central. And so Jesus at the center of our profession, Jesus at the center of our values, of our choices, of our relationships, Jesus at the center, that nothing and no one has higher priority, value, importance in our life than Jesus at the center. And we may have to leave the boat. We may have to leave what's comfortable, familiar, known, trustworthy that we've banked our life on. But let's not make something a profession or a familiarity or comfort zone, any of that. Let's not make any of that more important than Jesus. And when Peter swam to Jesus, he got up on the shore and they had a wonderful breakfast. Jesus had cooked fish. They brought some fish to him, had some bread there, and they're all sitting around having breakfast with Jesus. I love that. I think that is one of the most warm, soothing, appealing scenes that I can visualize in my head. I remember going to Israel, Sea of Galilee, and supposedly the area where that happened, and just kind of imagining, what did that look like? What did that feel like? And then the following conversation from breakfast, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? Peter's like, Lord, I love you. And it's tricky, right? Because this is right on the heels. This is really the first in-depth interaction that Peter has had with Jesus since Peter denied him, right? Some days earlier. And the first question Jesus says to him, do you love me? Eesh. How does that play out? I denied you, and now you're asking if I love you. And Peter, if frail, broken humanity, from very, very confronted with his inadequacies and weaknesses. And he says, Lord, I love you. I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. And he says it the second time, Peter, do you love me? I love you, Lord. Tend my lambs. And the third time, Peter, do you love me? Lord, I love you. And some theologians say 3 questions of love to counterpoint 3 betrayals. I don't know, that seems like an interesting idea. But I think for all of us, as we think about our lives, maybe there are times when we have betrayed Jesus for being comfortable, what's familiar, what's stable, what's predictable. And maybe Jesus is just asking us to kind of get out of the boat and asking, do you love me? Do you love me? I do love you. And our love for Jesus, let's let that be first and foremost the center. And then around that, Jesus crafts what we do, where we go, professions, decisions, priorities, values, relationships, but Jesus at the center. So I just encourage you as we think about this time that we would really keep Jesus front and center. And maybe we have to get out of some of our familiar comfort zones, but it's well worth the connection with Jesus, the growing with Jesus, to have that discomfort and yet the exchange depth of relationship and intimacy, connection with Jesus. So, time to hop out of the boat and let's go see what Jesus has for us, a great adventure. And don't forget, I'm going to give you a joke, right? Because jokes are super, super fun. What do you call a short mother? What do you call a short mother? A minimum. Tyler's behind the camera going, oh my gosh, which is so great. And just remind you as well, a week from tonight, ooh la la, we have this really cool worship night. You completely want to come, right? Seriously, it's one of the most amazing encounters that we get to have with Jesus. So get out of the boat, come to worship night, and of course, we'll see you Sunday as well. God bless you. We love your guts.